Stats South Africa has a new report released last week stating 39,000 jobs were created last year. But politicians, of course, prefer to speak to a prior report stating that 507,000 jobs were created last year. So there's dispute over the numbers. Let's begin with CNBC Africa speaking to Saijil Singh, who's a lead analyst at Coface. He says that both numbers are incorrect, and he tells us why.
The problem we have in terms of, if you're looking at just Africa, is that we're very stats focused. South Africa as a country, as an economy, as a people, we're very much concerned with certain numbers like that, with over 25%, 26% unemployment. That's not true. That is based on true statistical data from the revenue services with minor adjustments for estimations, but it's talking about tax-paying people. Now, what about the very small entrepreneurs in rural areas starting up a little business of his own? Is he technically unemployed? The stats would say it is.
Well, that sort of kicked us off, and here to unpack South Africa's jobs numbers is Pali Lahoshla, who is Statistician General of Stats SA, and Paul Joubert, who is a senior researcher at Solidarity's Research Institute. Pali, let's begin with you, and I have to just tell people what we said just before we go on air. We say to people, count 1 to 5 so we can test your microphone. So we asked him to count, and what did he say?
Well, I said I can't count.
Yeah, he's the statistician.
You wanted to get the voice level, and I thought speaking would give a better voice level rather than counting. Well, let me start with the misinformation that I've just seen on the television, that the numbers on unemployment are produced by SARS. It's not true. The numbers on unemployment and employment are produced by Stats SA. So that's a bag of misinformation that we have just heard. Unfortunately, we have these kinds of people talking to the public on issues they don't understand, they do not know, they do not research.
Let me pick up another interview which my colleague Alekagi was talking there to Saijil, but he talked to Azar Jameen a while ago, and Azar Jameen and he were talking about 507,000 jobs created in the formal sector. That's according to the Labour Force Survey statistics. Then the Quarterly Employment Survey, which is conducted among 22,000 business, 39,000, that was the number we saw there. So that's a huge difference, but different methodologies.
Indeed, I mean, there are two ways in which you measure employment or you look at labor markets. You need to understand how many people are unemployed, and that information you cannot get from establishments, because establishments by their nature are institutions that employ people. You can only know whether people are employed or not when you go to households. And given the fact that a number of employed are in the informal sector or in the non-registered businesses, you are likely to get more when you go to households than when you go to establishments which are VAT registered. In fact, not all establishments are VAT registered when they are also reaching the threshold, in fact, for VAT registration. So they are also formal. For instance, when you go to the Quarterly Labour Force Survey, 15,170,000 people are employed. When you go to the QES, which goes to the establishments, 8 million people are employed. So there is a huge difference between the two, which is the fact of formal and excluding, that excludes agriculture and excludes domestic work.
But let's talk about that particular gap and what it means for the credibility of the institution when we get two sets of numbers that come out, and it seems as if a certain set of numbers is punted quite a bit when it comes to politicking, and a certain set of numbers is almost de-emphasized. Which ones should we believe and why?
No, you have to believe in both. When you look at structure of the economy, you've got to use establishment information, because when you go to a household, where you are employed is not always as clear, because when you ask a person who is your employer, for instance, people working on the mines, outsourced as cleaners on the mines, they will say they are working for a mining company, when actually they are in cleaning services. So this is the difference, whereas when you go to the establishment, which is a mine, it will tell you how many people it employs on the mine. So the two are perfectly correct.
Okay.
They serve different purposes.
Paul, just to bring you in here and your perspective on these statistics.
Well, I think it might be going a bit far saying it's perfectly correct. Of course, I think the SG, as his staff calls him, will agree that it's never perfectly correct, but they are both good sets of numbers. I would certainly agree there. They are both good. They measure they seem to measure to the man in the street, they seem to measure the same thing, but they don't. They don't measure exactly the same thing, and that's why they differ. They should differ, because they're not measuring the same thing. The one asks enterprises how many people work here, and then there's a little bit of estimation going on there. The other one goes to households and asks them, do you work? And then it goes into estimation from there, and that's why they differ. And the household survey is where the unemployment figures come from, not the quarterly employment statistics where they ask employers. So it's completely normal that they do differ.
Let me come back and perhaps let me borrow that term SG, if I may. Let's go back to that last point that you ended on, and you said it's the purpose for what these numbers are used for that's important. We're in a year where elections are a few weeks away. There has been allegations that perhaps you are peddling to some of the pressures that are coming from the political side. Are you sensitive to the political pressures, and does it influence in any way the numbers that you're putting out?
The only pressures I have are methodological ones. That the quality of the information, the Statistics Act protects the statistician general from being influenced politically. And if he abuses that privilege that the Act imposes on him, the statistician general must resign. There's no political pressure. Even if it were there, the statistician general would have to show the powers, the Act.
You could say you've never had even an informal phone call or a suggestion round the corner that perhaps you should just put that set of numbers out there?
No, I don't think when people do call, they just want to understand what the issues are around the numbers. And of course, people want you to explain and advise on policy on the numbers quite innocently, thinking that given that we have provided the numbers, what are the solutions? And that I get all the time whenever I'm addressing public. What are the solutions? And of course I say mine is to count, not to dabble in policy. Of course at times we do discuss things because I'm not blind to the issues that afflict society.
A key issue. Do we have jobless growth in South Africa or not?
Well, when we have 653,000 jobs year on year from 2012 to 2013, quarter on quarter, or rather in 2012 last quarter to 2013 last quarter, it can be jobless. We did have a dip where we lost a number of jobs.
But I think the point that's been made by the economist, I quoted Azar Jamin, Kees Bruggeman's also in February talking about saying, if you've got low growth and we also have jobless growth, Paul, you're in the research thing, it just doesn't make sense that so many jobs could have been created. What are your findings on this? And Solidarity, what is its perspective on this, the employment numbers?
Well, first of all, these figures are estimates, so it's never a case that they will... they do have some margin of error, so that has to be kept in mind, and it's quite significant. I mean, it's as good as it's possible to do it with the budget, I think, from Stats SA, but there is some margin of error. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is also one has to keep in mind certain seasonal differences, and then furthermore the way specifically the household survey is done, the labour force survey, the quarterly labour force survey. Because in the way that the questions are asked, someone who even has a small, very low paid, very temporary almost job still gets counted as employed. And so it might seem that that person's situation, even though they might have a job, even if it's an EPWP, very low paid, the Expanded Public Works Program, those kinds of job, very low paid, very short term often, that person will be counted as employed if they were visited at the home and asked, did you work in the month preceding or the week or so preceding this survey? So that does influence the numbers. People often, when they see the numbers of employed people, they think this should mean everybody having a nice, steady job in a very safe environment, and that's not the case. Those figures count everyone who has any form of job.
But Paul, I'm going to belabor the point of politics. I mean, every single party that is contesting on the 7th of May has put employment and job creation at the top of their mandate, and this is what they're using to go into the battlefield. And I want to go back to Solidarity. You have two definitions of unemployment. You have a narrow definition and an expanded definition. What's the difference between the two, and how does that influence the numbers that we get from the SG?
Well, we don't have that definition. It's Stats SA as well. It's actually the International Labour Organization's definition. The narrow definition counts only people who are actively searching for work as unemployed, and the wider definition also counts people who have become discouraged. We see that specifically at Limpopo. There's very many people there.
Let's get back to these numbers, where we've got lots of numbers, Polly. Now, you put them out. To what extent do you have a right, or do you feel you have a duty, or what room do you have to interpret? In other words, to say, guys, we're putting out all these numbers, we know the methodologies, we understand these numbers because we work with them all the time. This is how you need to use them. This is how you need to understand them, as opposed to just putting them out there and people...
Yes, that's our duty. The Statistician General has to advise on the proper use, in fact, to rebuke those who abuse the numbers. So if politicians start abusing the numbers, I have a moral duty and a statutory duty to advise against such abuses of numbers.
Do they abuse the numbers?
At times they do.
Have you ever had to use those powers?
Well, not publicly, but I do advise people when they have misinterpreted the numbers.
Let's look at another issue, Polly, which is the census, and that's perhaps the biggest single piece of information that you put out, or set of information. There's methodology issues there too. I mean, one hears about photographs from the air, you have door-to-door counting. The old-fashioned way was that at midnight on a particular day you had to say where you were and how many people were in your house. South Africa is more complicated than that, isn't it?
Well, all countries are complicated because you can't do this on a single day unless you actually impose a curfew, as you do in Turkey, Nigeria, and Iraq. But people still move, so you run this over a period of time in the trust that they will remember the date where they were on the night of the census, on the reference date. So that's quite a complicating factor, especially when you have to adjust for undercount. Methodologically, it's sound to have a reference night, but practically people don't usually remember that easily where they were on the night.
I'm quite certain that you have worked in some improvements into the process around the census. Talk us through some of those, and particularly how are you ensuring that the field force has the adequate capacity and the skill to get the job done right and to reduce the margin of error?
Well, previously we used to train these people for 2 days. Now we take about 2 weeks to train the enumerators on how they should conduct the census. You will agree with me that the campaign we mounted in the 2011 census was the most fantastic campaign ever mounted to raise the level of awareness. Everybody knew that there was a census. But the practical situation in South Africa of apartheid spatial distribution of settlements creates difficulties for people to be enumerated because they start going to work from 4 o'clock, come back after 10. Enumerators work between 8 o'clock and probably
different provinces. Urbanization. So Gauteng is building, I saw a stat the other day, 20,000 houses a year, but there are more people who are coming from rural areas who need houses. So your numbers are crucial in the planning, particularly for a province like Gauteng or the Western Cape.
Indeed. I mean, at the moment, we actually have to look at other methods of sensing. Remote sensing is one of those where you can actually use a satellite to see where change detection. Those are some of the things that we have to start using because the census is only 5 years legislatively, but our practice is moving to 10 years because 5 years is too close and stretches the organization. So there are other techniques that we have to use and also use short-term surveys to try and detect and understand trends. Indeed, Gauteng is a magnet. It's actually attracting a lot of people. We didn't expect the numbers to be the way they are and the extent to which it surpassed KwaZulu-Natal.
We'll have to end there. Fascinating stuff from Polly Lahoshla, who is a Statistician General at Stats SA, of course, and Paul Hubert, Senior Researcher at Solidarity's Research Institute. After the break, we're going to look at the markets, so don't go away.